Hi there. You're listening to Bad Art, a podcast about the politics of art in the 21st century. I'm Colin McLaughlin-Alcock, here with my co-host.
I'm Mary Grushko. Nice to hear from you all again.
Yeah, it's nice to be back. So today, we're putting public art on trial. Public art is frequently produced as a political project of social engineering, through which politicians aim to change the ways that we live and experience the world around us. How successful have these art projects been? Have they changed urban life in the United States? And is this change for better or for worse? This is what we aim to find out in the episode today. Public art is now on trial. Thanks for joining us. Welcome to Bad Art. Okay, welcome to Bad Art. Our story begins in the 1960s. This was a time of rapid expansion of public art in the United States, largely as a result of the wider expansion of the federal bureaucracy, beginning with FDR's New Deal and moving through Johnson's Great Society. So you have the establishment of the General Services Administration, the purposes of which is to maintain federal buildings and infrastructure. The General Services Administration starts something called the Art and Architecture Program in 1963, putting major pieces of fine art into new government buildings. In 1965, you have the establishment of the National Endowment for the Arts. And in 1967, it starts its Art in Public Places program, which over time commissioned hundreds of pieces of public art in the United States. And then you have at the municipal level the rise of what are called percent for art programs. These are programs where the municipal budget dedicates money to public art, either through a fraction of the budget or through a tax on new construction. And all of these programs together consolidated to begin putting significant amounts of public art into cities. So just to give an idea of what they're sponsoring at this time, the first piece sponsored through the NEA's Art in Public Places program is a massive sculpture by Alexander Calder. It's called the Grand Vitesse. It's 43 feet tall, 54 feet long, 30 feet wide. It's got these big red panels, blobby in shape. It sort of looks to me like a very abstract elephant. It's placed on the plaza at the newly completed City Hall in downtown Grand Rapids, Michigan. Another piece from this time, also 1967, this one municipally sponsored, is the giant Picasso sculpture at Daley Plaza in Chicago. This one is 50 feet tall. It weighs 160 tons. It's got these big slabs of metal making up a kind of a cubist face. These are explicitly chosen to be landmark pieces to capture widespread public attention, and both have become symbols of the cities where they are.
So can I ask you
Yeah,
something?
yeah, go ahead.
So I guess my question is, did public art basically only mean gigantic sculptures to these people?
Yeah, yeah. So public art basically did only mean gigantic sculptures to these people, and gigantic sculptures by famous existing artists, mostly men. Um,
Why? Why in the world?
well, they didn't have an idea of what public art was. So if you want to defend it, it's like it's what is art in the 1960s? It's, you know, genius white men making their creativity in cubism or whatever else, right? So there is this idea that this is what art is. And the first move to public art is just to take that from the museum and put it outside.
So sort of to put it very reductively, take the art that was on a canvas and re-experience it in giant sculpture form. So the Picasso canvases, those are tucked away in the museum. 50-foot Picasso sculpture, now you're really talking.
Yeah, so the only difference between what you'd see in a museum and what you'd see outside is that it often was bigger than a museum could accommodate.
So you could see it while the bus is taking you down the street.
In
You
theory,
don't
yeah.
want to.
You could see it from the bus, but they are also sort of intended to be tourist destinations, like something to go and see. You want to be able to draw people in with the promise of this art. Now, whether or not that worked, interesting question, but that's the idea is that these are landmarks. So part of their scale is gravitational almost to attract attention.
I don't want to muddy the waters, but the word that immediately comes to mind for me is monumental, right? So maybe actual monuments of well-known figures have become passé, but that idea of the monumental scale and the feeling of spectacle and awe, um, it sounds like is still very much present.
Yeah, so yes, but it's important to note how different this felt to audiences at the time. So there is a stark difference between a monument of a war hero or something and this art that is just art that doesn't look like, well, it looks like something, but it's not specifically representational, it's abstract. Its ideas are artistic rather than narrative in the sense that like national narrative in the sense that a monument would be. And it was often controversial for those reasons. People weren't used to art that didn't valorize history in that same specific way. The giant Picasso, when it was installed in 1967, it was people didn't like it. And so it was protested, it was mocked, the newspapers satirized it, suggested all of the better things that they could put there, such as a giant pickle. Um, and politicians campaigned against it and said, we've got to get rid of this and replace it with something else. And the reason, or one of the reasons why it was so unpopular was because Chicagoans just didn't really know what public art was in 1967. There was not an experience of public art at that time other than monuments of famous figures. But art as art's sake was not something that was common in Chicago in the 1960s. And this piece is often described as a game changer, not just for Chicago, but for the United States from making public art a thing that people have. So monumental in scale, yes, but in purpose, no. It's quite a different thing. And I think it's interesting to think about as we get started for this episode because you walk around the city today, Chicago, Philadelphia, Boston, you'll see lots of public art around. It's become part of our atmosphere. We're used to it. We know that it's a thing that happens in cities. And yet, there was a time when this wasn't obvious, wasn't understood, at least in the US. And so it raises some questions. Why did politicians decide to start putting public art in their cities? What were they hoping to achieve?
Can I throw in some other questions that we may or may not get to?
Sure. Yeah, go ahead.
Thinking about the Picasso sculpture in Daley Plaza versus thinking about the bean
Hmm.
in what is it, Millennium Park, makes me think about the difference between these two public sculptures.
For listeners, the Bean by Anish Kapoor is another very popular public art sculpture in Chicago. It's sort of become an icon of the city. It's a mirrored bean-shaped sculpture, which is at the center of a lot of events. One thing people like about it is the way its surface distorts a reflection of the city, inviting people to walk around and interact with it.
Right? Um, you stated that in order to understand or appreciate the Picasso sculpture, Chicagoans first had to be educated or enculturated into this tradition of public art, right? It wasn't immediately obvious to them what to do with the sculpture. They had to be taught how to appreciate it, how to interact with it. Now, it's possible that the reception of the bean has been different because all of that enculturation and education about public art had already happened by the time the bean was installed. But I actually am going to argue that that doesn't explain the different reception that it had. I would argue that the bean is something that people can interact with even when they are untutored in the ways of public art. They immediately see it and know how to engage with it, right? So I think part of what you're pointing at is maybe a disjuncture between public art that is there for interaction and public art that is there for contemplation. And I think that the 1960s era of public art is about art that is there for the public's betterment, for the public to contemplate and, learn something from or feel in some way changed or challenged by. Later on, you get this public art tradition that doesn't really seem to be asking very much of the public, doesn't really seem to be challenging them, is really just sort of there to be charismatic for people to have fun with, for people to play with, right? I think fancy art people would say it's a dumbing down of public art. Poptimists might say it is a democratization of public art. But I think that what's pretty clear in the contrast between these two sculptures, the Picasso sculpture and Kapoor's Bean, is that they represent two different moments of public art in America. And so I think part of, I hope part of what we'll be doing today is thinking about how did we get from the Picasso sculpture to the bean and trying to understand that cultural sea change when it comes to public art.
Yeah, I think that distinction is really important. And one of the things we are going to try to do today is to distinguish between different ideas of what public art is or what it should do as it's developed between the 1960s and today. So one other thing to say is this often gets called plop art. So this era of these giant sculptures, it gets called plop art because you're just taking a sculpture and you're plopping it down somewhere. It doesn't really matter where it is. So you could take this Picasso and, ship it to Boston or ship it to London or ship it to Beijing, and it would be the same sculpture. Like nothing about it would change. Whereas I think art today has a different relationship to place. So it's called plop art, and that's like a derisive term that it's somewhat sort of dropped down into the middle of urban space.
I appreciate the derisiveness. I think that's a great phrase. It is interesting to think about these sculptures that are devoid of context and detached from place in contrast to, how we often experience sculpture today. So I'm thinking about outdoor sculpture parks like Storm King in the Hudson Valley. There's this idea of the ways in which different sculptures are in conversation with one another, in conversation with either the architecture of a building if they're indoors, or with a landscape if they're displayed outdoors. And something about the idea of these sculptures just being plopped in, regardless of context, does feel to me like it resonates with this idea of the masterwork by a genius,
Yeah.
right? Um, so very much like if you're thinking about that masterwork tradition, it's very much about standalone works of art that are so powerful that they completely overpower what any context that you could put them in, right? And this is around the same time, I think, that the state of the art for museum design is going toward what we experience, the way we experience museums now, right? That the museum should minimize any possible distractions to the artwork that is it's displayed inside, right? So the walls of the museum shouldn't have any dramatic features to them. The museum architecture should, in the display areas, should be minimally obtrusive. The lighting should illuminate the artwork, but not really do anything else. So everything else is supposed to melt away and become a neutral backdrop for the display of the artistic masterwork. And it sounds like for all that these are public artworks in urban areas, there's a little bit of that same idea to how these sculptures are being displayed, right? To some extent, the city is not really the backdrop anymore. The city is supposed to melt away so that all you're looking at is, ta-da, here's the Picasso sculpture.
Yeah, so that's very important in two ways, right? And one of them is just that at this time, a lot of people feel like the urban environment is oppressive. You have skyscrapers, big building projects, dwarfing the scale of the human. There's a certain sense that the city has become an unpleasant place to be. And so having the artwork dissolve the city behind it, become a focus of attention, is supposed to brighten urban life. That's one claim.
Oh, I get it. So it's the idea is, oh, you poor depressed urbanites, let us enliven your sad, downtrodden lives through this art.
Absolutely. But also even more so because there's also the same idea that there is historically in museums that exposure to art stimulates the mind, right? And so if there's a sense that urban populations are depraved in some way, deficient, art is supposed to move them out of their like criminal behavioral routes that they're in and expose them to aspire to something more. So there is a social engineering aspect to the artwork as well, that it will provoke the mind and solve urban problems by pushing people forward into more creative, civilized, aspirational frames of mind than sort of the urban rabble.
Right. So, in other words, if today the federal government is attempting a civilizing mission on cities with the argument that they're a mix of coastal derelicts and coastal elites, this is a time period where the elite part isn't really part of the equation, where urban dwellers are seen as derelicts in need of moral improvement, and the art is going to be the way that that moral improvement is achieved.
Yeah. So we should set ourselves in the 1960s urban environment, right? This is a time of urban decline, largely due to federal government subsidizing the building of the suburbs, which were racially exclusive, and leading to middle and wealthy white people evacuating the cities and moving to the suburbs, leaving poor people and black people in the cities, but without the tax base that keeps the city running. So cities were declining and had a lot of problems as a result of this. They were facing bankruptcy often. And so one of the things that municipal governments are doing at this time is trying to revitalize the city. How do we make the city work again? And one of the things that they do is what's called urban renewal, which is basically clearing black housing out of the way to make space for businesses and white people to move back in.
Are they really? Here's a question
Yeah,
about urban renewal. Um, Are they really, is the goal of urban renewal to get white people to move back into the city as residents? Or is the goal for them to work there and visit there and
work
spend
and
their
shop,
leisure?
work and shop and leisure. Yeah.
Right.
And so public art plays an important role in this too, right? One, as beautification, like, look, there's a Picasso to come and see. Look, there's an Alexander Calder sculpture to come and see. But two, these are actually built in renewed areas, right? And so the very first sculpture that the National Endowment for the Arts sponsored is this Alexander Calder Le Grand Vitesse. Well, it's built in downtown Grand Rapids on property that has just been bulldozed. That's been seized by eminent domain. There are 120 buildings that have been bulldozed, and they're replaced by City Hall and a business complex. And at the center of this, they place the gigantic monumental sculpture that is the signature of the city's urban renewal. And I think it's important, like this art is attracting people, but it's also taking up place. It's giving a material taking of urban space for the urban renewal project.
Say a little bit more about that last point that you made. I'm not sure I completely follow.
Right. So, I mean, one of the things about these giant sculptures is that they take up space. And so if as a municipal leader, one of your goals is to clear out poor black people from the city center, you need to put something where they were. And often this is art. So the Calder sculpture is put on top of a plaza that is built on top of eminent domain seized land.
So it sort of becomes the warrant for having needed to exercise eminent domain in the first place. Like, in other words, really what cities want at this moment in time is just to use eminent domain to clear out Black people. But in some cases, it seems like what they were really looking for is a loftier justification for these policies. So maybe it's a fig leaf for accusations of racism. I'm just ventriloquizing, right? As
Hmm.
a would-be mayoral administration, municipal administration in the 60s, I could imagine them saying things like, we're not kicking Black people out of their homes unnecessarily. We're doing it because we have this larger ambition to make the city a place of art, to make it a place that's nurturing, a place where the people who live here can live life to its fullest capacity, including the human spirit, and not just survival.
Yeah, I think so. Art is part of this idea that it is vitalizing space that had been hotbeds of crime or decay or blight, this ambiguous word. So in Grand Rapids, they said this area is becoming a flop house district. It's becoming a slum. So it wasn't even a slum, right? It's like there's the threat of it
It's
becoming a slum.
becoming, yeah.
And because of that threat, it's necessary to clear out all of the 120 homes and businesses and put in a new civic center that's designed to be a focus of downtown for a new type of urban resident or consumer. And and art absolutely gives that license, but it physically holds the space. And I do think that's important. This is a common thing. The Los Angeles Museum of Contemporary Art, LA MoCA, is based on the site of a former Black neighborhood, holds the space where the neighborhood had been. The Philadelphia Museum of Art in a former Black neighborhood at the end of a parkway. All of this is bulldozed Black community. I think there's a long history of art being put physically in places to hold the place where uh, undesirable Black communities have been removed from. And I think this is a huge part of the story of public art in the United States is the recognition that if we have these urban renewal campaigns going on, we can get funds to put art, create these big plazas, and just take the space away from housing towards a new civic identity. Mhm.
So the art is designed to not really have a specificity of place to it, so as to justify urban renewal, so as to claim space that used to be people's homes. And it feels like it would have been so easy for this to enter a death spiral, right? Where there's more and more public art, more and more urban renewal, less and less of what makes each city unique. And yet, that's not the whole story, right? That's not where we ended up. In fact, there has been this sea change in public art where today it is site specific. And I think that would not have been something that anyone working on this issue in the 60s would have anticipated. So how did we get there? How is it that public art became something that is so closely linked to the place where it's located?
Yeah, so I mean, there's a reaction to plop art, right? It is what is this? It's just dropped down here. It doesn't have any relation to its place. And so both
So
artists and planners begin saying, well, this should be related to its place.
do
Um,
artists and planners begin saying this because regular people hated it or because other artists and planners hated it?
yes, it's partly because other people hate it as part of trying to justify why the art should be there. And I think, a thing that becomes a common theme is artists actually have to justify why is art in public space. It's never, I feel like today it's a thing we take for granted. At least in Philadelphia where I live, there's public art everywhere. And I was like, okay. But there's a long period of time where art in public space is not accepted. Do you know what I mean? And so artists have to continually justify why are we here? And one of the ways they try to do that is by saying, okay, plop art doesn't quite work, but we're going to make art that is about the place where it is. But the NEA says in the early 1970s, art has to take the location into consideration. And the planning commissions that are granting art have to take the site into consideration. So it becomes part of the guidelines for accepting art commissions that they have to be site responsive. So what does that mean?
Yeah, what does that mean?
At first, it means that artists work really closely with architects and become basically designers. So the first iteration of site-specific art is basically ornamentation. It's seating, it's shade provision, it's purposeful. And there is a sense that it's losing some of the artisticness, right? In the effort to be part of the place, it becomes part of the architecture, becomes part of the design, but becomes subordinated to the design, and yet becomes very locational.
Which itself is, that idea that the art loses its artisticness because it's a bench or shade is itself part of the problematic historical trajectory of art, right? The idea that furniture design is a form of craft or ornamentation rather than true artistic expression, we could certainly make a lot of critiques of, right? I think that the gender critique there is quite persuasive.
Well, it's noteworthy, right, that you say that the artists who are making public seating as site-specific art are women or they're gay. And so it is, very clearly effeminized, this section of art. And that's again part of the reaction to it. It's not this masculine hero plopping down their idea and forcing it upon the world in the way of a Picasso or a Calder.
It lacks muscularity.
It lacks muscularity in a big way. So, so as we said, art is becoming subordinated to the architect's idea of the place. Again, this is very clearly in the interest of urban development, but artists begin to push back. Why should we be subordinate to what the architects are doing? Art has its own value and should be promoted as such. And one of the biggest name artists arguing this point is Richard Serra. And I want to share with you his argument on this point.
Goody. I'm very excited.
Yeah. So we're going to listen to two clips of Sarah. First, him talking about what other public art is doing, and then him talking about what he does. So this is him talking about other public art.
I think one of the problems you have with most public sculpture in America right now is that it's co-opted by the buildings that it's put in front of. So you have a condition where you have a lot of baubles on 6th Avenue, and they purport to be sculpture, but they're absolutely undercut because they fall within the omnificence of IBM or Xerox or whatever, and any seriousness they might have had is completely consumed by the power of the corporate interests. So they become corporate icons in the same way that a lot of paintings become corporate emblems once they're housed in banks or put up for the middle class to aspire to.
That's piece one. And then piece two, talking about what he does.
For a public space, do you conceive of it different than the pieces you make for the galleries?
What I've been trying to do since about 1970 is make pieces that are really site-specific, which means that I take the cues from the space, but I don't try to augment the space or decorate the space or garnish the space or put a new zipatone on the space. What I try to do is redefine the space, not re-represent the space. And what I mean by redefine the space is turn the space into one of a sculptural concern. Often what happens is that's different than the original intention of the space. And when you start changing people's descriptions of spaces, namely, decorative plazas into sculptural concerns, people get very nervous because they don't want their descriptions tampered with.
So that's Richard Serra talking about what public art is and what he thinks it should be. Do you have any immediate thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I'm interested in the disjuncture between what Richard Serra said here and what you were describing as artist concern in this moment in time. In other words, I'm not sure that I really buy that Richard Serra is representing this point of view that says, why should artists be subordinate to architecture? What I heard him saying is, why should artists be subordinate to corporations?
I would agree, but I think it is the corporate planning of the space. So why should art be absorbed into the office building almost as part of its aesthetic, you know? Or
Yeah, I
the
don't.
okay.
Sorry, go on.
No, no, that's fine.
No, finish. Sorry, I interrupted. I want to hear you finish your point.
The sculpture becomes a bauble in the IBM office. It becomes part of the office and not, like it becomes an icon. It becomes appropriated because of the way it's incorporated into the physical layout of the building.
See, I guess I understood the bauble point as being less about physical figuration and description and more about a moral configuration, because he follows that point about the bauble by saying, or anything else that the middle class is told that they should aspire to. So I understood the bauble point as being about this attempt to conduct a moral education for the middle classes through art, right? I think that's what he has a real issue with, and particularly the way that that education of middle class aspirations is tied to what at the time were these really dominant, like corporate coded middle brow concerns, right? He's really railing against the middle browness of art at this moment in time, right? And so
Yeah.
I was reading his his issue with decoration and ornamentation and baubles as coming out of that those are very much to me sort of the trappings of middle brow, mid-century, mid 20th century American culture. And so he's trying to say, well, you know, my work isn't about decoration, it's about a completely different experience of space.
Yes, I would agree with that. And I think like it's not about decoration is key for him. And he also like he later in this interview he starts railing about the things that the public wants. He's like, they would like all of the sculpture to be in gold, but I make it in rusty steel. And they would like to see flags draped off the ends of the plinth, but I am not going to do that. And they want to see sculptures of people they recognize, but I am doing like non-representational art. So he has this like running statement about how he's resisting the kitsch of middle class expectation with the art that he
You
makes.
know, I'm really glad that Richard Serra passed away last year.
Oh no. Go ahead.
I'm not, I mean, let's be clear, I'm not happy that he passed away. I wish that he were still with us, but um and I guess in some ways I miss his voice in this moment. But God, what do you think that Richard Serra would have said about about the Trumpification of Washington, right? Not, I'm sure that he never had particularly glowing reviews of art and architecture in Washington, D.C. to begin with, but the gold-plated everything, the Garden of Heroes, like in some ways he would have been the perfect antagonist to this artistic moment.
I do think, yeah, Richard Serra and Trump's architectural and artistic vision are complete opposites in some way. And that's not to I like Richard Serra, but that's not to make him a hero for whatever I believe in as much as I hate Trump, but they are very opposite viewpoints about what aesthetics is. And I think he would really hate that the gildification of the White House, the sculpture programs and everything else that Trump is doing with his aesthetic programming.
And, I think it's telling that this interview clip that you played is from 1983, right?
Yeah.
So, as with many other things, the current Trump administration is really ventriloquizing the white middle classes circa 1983.
Yeah, absolutely. And there is this and also Reagan, right? Like there's people like to disconnect Trump from the Republican past, but one of Sarah's complaints is the Reagan administration asked me to make something. They tried to put some American flags on the end of it. I said, no, I'm not going to do that. But there's already a resistance to Republican aesthetics, let's say, which he is trying to articulate something else in a moment of pretty severe Republican backlash at the time.
And maybe I'm biased because I also like Richard Serra's work. This is the Bad Art podcast coming out as pro Richard Serra. I I mean, I was not alive yet at the time that he gave this interview, but my understanding of the 80s and 90s in American public art is that Serra's views were quite influential. He really was able to, not just him alone, right? But there was this sea change in public art where it did for a while become much more sculptural, again, concerned with form, but in a site-specific way.
Well, this is an interesting thing because Richard Serra has two different, I guess, directions of influence. And one is with artists, he's a huge big name artist, like as big an art star as you can be, basically, and commands a lot of respect, gets a lot of commissions, influences other artists in thinking about what art should be. But on the other hand, he often gets a really visceral, angry response to the art that he makes. And that also has influence, right? So we should say what art he makes. He's had a few stylistic changes, but for our purposes, this site-specific stuff is they're tall sheets of steel, like really towering, and they often bend or curve around and create little pathways where you go into a space that's created by the steel and you're in sort of a room or a chamber and you can come out. So it transforms the plaza or the room that it's in into a space that's broken up into different contemplative spaces. One of the things I was thinking about getting ready one of the things I like about it, when I was, 10, I liked to build pillow forts. And it's a very like pillow forty, except in, towering pieces of steel instead of small little pillows. And you do enter new spaces. You're removed from the space that you're in walking through or around his artwork.
I often have this feeling when I'm walking through a Richard Serra artwork of being inside the belly of a whale.
Mm,
Um, And I mean, I don't know whale anatomy. Like, do whales have giant rib cages? I don't know, but that's how I feel when I'm inside these sculptures, is that I'm inside the rib cage of some gigantic prehistoric beast. And for me, that feeling of you can't see above them, right? The steel walls are multiple times taller than a person. So you can't see out of them. They do weird things with sound, so you also can't really hear what's going on outside of the sculpture. To me, there's this feeling of being underwater that is very interesting to experience in especially in a space that is otherwise quite crowded, right? You have this sense of interiority.
yeah, I like the idea of being underwater, and I think that fits with my experience. Or being in a cave, like there's a removal and you're separated. But there are people who don't like it, right?
They're Philistines. How could you not like being in a pillow fort underwater?
I don't know, but they don't. So there are German politicians that campaign against never letting another Richard Serra happen again. There's a big outrage at a piece that gets put in St. Louis. And then he makes this famously controversial piece in New York called Tilted Arc, which is at the Federal Plaza, or sorry, the Foley Plaza in front of the federal courthouse. And there's a plaza there. And what Tilted Arc is it's 12 feet tall, 120 feet long, piece of steel. It leans and bends, and it cuts across the plaza, basically cutting it in half. And the reaction
And
was
we should say that this is not one of the pillow fort
no.
works. There's no inside to Tilted Arc.
But th there is a division of what was a previously open space into multiple spaces of engagement from his perspective.
Yes.
The response, again, twofold. Artists, wow, this is incredible. I love it. Like this is generally the art response. But some of the people who work in the building say, hey, this is in the way. I really don't like having to walk around it. This is messing up my day. And then this kind of gets out of hand. So not only is it in the way, it's dangerous. Someone might put a bomb there. and it will blow up literally a thing that they said, that because of the way it leans, if someone bombs the Federal Plaza, the bombs will hit higher floors and be more dangerous. That
Can
it
I just
is,
can I just point out that this is not the first episode that we've recorded where whatever art people don't like or whatever architecture they don't like is something that they imagine as this would be the perfect place to plant a bomb.
yeah.
Like, what's up with that?
So for the listener, we haven't released the episode because it didn't work out. We had some recording difficulties, but we recorded an episode about federal architecture, and people complaining about federal architecture will say, "Well, a terrorist could take us out in this building." Like it is a thing, and my best explanation is it's just throwing stuff at the walls, and there's a sense that security is a reason to protect, federal buildings from what art could do.
See, I'm tempted to psychologize it and say that people are claiming that this art or architecture they don't like would be the perfect place to plant a bomb. Or, this isn't even the first time that we've heard something about the aesthetic form means that a bomb here would be more dangerous than a bomb somewhere
Right.
else. I'm tempted to therapize these concerns and say that people are claiming on some level this art or architecture makes them feel unsafe. Maybe the fact that they're taking it to this physical plane of a terroristic threat, that might not be literally accurate, but maybe they're trying to express something of the psychological or emotional lack of safety that they feel from this art in a way that they think other people will respond to and feel an urgency and a reality to.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. And it fits with other things they're saying. So they're saying rats are attracted to the tilted arc and can run along its wall. It's attracting graffiti, and therefore, since it's 1980s New York, crime. So there's this sense of just general chaos inspired by the wall, which I do think, like the sense of this upsets me, makes me feel unsafe or unsecure. And so here are all of the bigger insecurities that I can attach to it. Makes a lot of sense. Anyway, a judge who works in the federal building, Judge Ray, really doesn't like it. So he starts a petition to get it removed and ends up having a hearing about the tilted arc in which it eventually does get removed. And in the hearing, there are different positions which get articulated, which I think are interesting and important. There's what is the right of the people in the building? So don't they have a right to determine how the space is used? Versus what is the right of the artist? Is there freedom of speech under attack if a small number of people who don't like an artwork can have it removed? And so some people are comparing it to book burning, so there are these two different ideas of whose rights are at stake in this artwork that comes up in what's called the trial of Tilted Arc. Let me share another clip with you. So this is Judge Ree explaining what he thinks is at stake.
What is art and what is artistic expression is not the issue before us today. The issue is, what is the governmental responsibility in arriving at a decision to place art that is paid for with public funds in a public plaza or other public place? I emphasize that we are not concerned with private art paid for with private funds to be placed on private property. The public, however, that term may be defined, should participate in the decision-making process to purchase public art with public funds for a public place.
So,
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting to me how much the judge is concerned with maintaining this public versus private distinction, right? And so to Judge Ree, public art means art that is paid for with public money. Therefore, his logic is that money belongs to all the taxpayers, and therefore the taxpayers should participate in determining which art is purchased with their funds and how that art is displayed. Which, when I think about all the other things that taxpayer money is used for, is kind of a wild position. Taxpayers didn't decide to fight the Vietnam War. Taxpayers didn't decide a lot of things. So why is art different?
Well, I think it's an interesting question. I also think if you believe in representative democracy, then the public did decide, right? There were representatives of the public who worked for the GSA who made the decision that this art belonged there. And so there was a public process by which the thing was decided upon. One of the questions that I get into a lot in my classes is who gets to make these decisions actually is a hugely politically consequential process. And one of the things that comes out of this, if artists have been the fulcrum of deciding what art gets placed in public places, like, is this good art? We'll pick the best art, we'll put it in the place. It shifts to finding more representatives of what Judge Ray would call the public. So people who live in the buildings, politicians specific to that site, and also business leaders. So there's a shift from an artistic concern to a corporate and community concern in deciding how public art gets appointed. But it's still not, most of the time, it's still not everyone who works in the building gets surveyed and they get to decide what they want. That's an inoperable process.
Right. In a way, it is a position that buys into the view that artists are just a particular type of designer, right? The intuition here is this is art that people have to live with as part of their everyday lives, and therefore it should be functional, comfortable, and meaningful for them.
So, and this is a big point that comes up with Sarah's response is everyone's saying it should be functional. It's destroying the function of the plaza. And he makes an argument, art itself is a function.
The remaining half of the space was left open for social functions of any kind. It is bogus and false to say that the social function of the plaza is destroyed. Also, the experience of art itself is a social function. It is curious to me that people who are concerned with function can't even put water in their fountain.
So that it has a purpose in being there, and that purpose is art. And this again is a divide over what should public art be doing. Should it be art? Should it be serving the public? Should it be useful? Basically, Sarah loses, right? So the big outcome of the trial of Tilted Arc is that major governmental agencies that spend money on public art change their granting procedures to ensure community consultation, quote unquote, whatever that means, and use. That art that's being made after Tilted Arc gets dismantled has to justify itself as being useful in ways that it didn't before. So the replacement for Tilted Arc is, I'll show you a picture. The replacement for Tilted Arc is a redesign of the plaza by a landscape architect, still sponsored by the GSA's Art in Public Places program, but it's benches that curve around and little green spaces. So it's turning it into a park where people can sit and eat their lunch and hang out in front of the court. It's a very different idea of what public art is.
I can see why Richard Serra would have an issue with this. Certainly, what he's looking for is art that makes people rethink something as basic as what are the spaces that they move through. He doesn't want people to take that for granted, right? He wants them to rethink their relationship with form and space. And Martha Schwartz, who designed what replaced Tilted Arc, there's these like very serpentine forms, right, to the benches that she designed. So there's still a sense of wanting there to be forms that break up the vast expanse of the plaza. But just looking at the images, you don't get the feeling that she is out to disrupt people's taken for granted experience of the space. It's a work that seems to be much more concerned with meeting people where they're at, right? And helping them maybe deepen their engagement with spaces that they would otherwise be moving through in a more rapid fashion. And I guess, you had earlier described Richard Serra's artworks as contemplative, right? And I actually think that there is a contemplative quality to Martha Schwartz's design for the square. If you think about contemplation as being a deepening of attention, a deepening of attachment to place, I think that these benches achieve that. Like, even though this replaced the Sarah, I don't think that they are complete opposite. I don't think that they're perfect opposites in what they set out to achieve.
That's interesting. I do. It's funny because I look at this and I think, oh, that looks nice, and there's lots of stuff like this in Philadelphia now where there are old plazas or parks that have been redesigned in ways similar to this to sort of create little engaging spaces where you can sit and places for people to meet and sit and hang out and, little fountains and things like that. And it is nice, at this abstract level, but it is clearly a different idea of what art is for than the disruptive. Because you're right, it's not it doesn't challenge you. It's just, hey, come sit here, relax, which is nice in its way, but it's a very different thing.
Right. It maybe doesn't feel like art with a capital A.
Yep. And maybe that's gendered in the very way you were describing earlier, right? Like again, it's doing something different. It's not authorial in the same way. Although this clearly reflects like
Yeah.
a designer's hand, but it is a different idea of the relationship between the artist and the public.
I think it is a really gendered dynamic. I think that hits the nail on the head. I also am thinking about indigenous design traditions, right? Design traditions where the point of the form is to deepen an engagement with place as it actually exists, not to radically alter either the place or people's experiences of that place, right? In some ways, Sarah's work seeks to create a disconnection or a disjuncture between people and the landscape that they're actually in the service of getting them to experience something different. And against that, you could position a tradition that says, actually, art should help people to more fully inhabit the places where they actually are. And I think that for good or for ill, that is what a lot of public art has become today. And you know what? People really love it. And I don't think it's a bad thing for people to really love the cities where they live. When I was living in Barcelona, Barcelona residents would often, like people that I was friends with, would go visit New York and they would come back and rave to me about the pedestrianization of Times Square. They loved it. They thought having a square where people can just sit at cafe tables was the most exciting thing, right? And so on some level, you could say, well, the pedestrianization of Times Square, is it art, right? Like, and it's not art with a capital A, but is it a meaningful intervention into public space that democratizes it, that changes what people see when they look at Times Square, that changes their experience of form in the city? I think it checks all of those boxes.
I'd agree, but I'd throw in one caveat, which is just that part of that it being nice is gentrification, right? And so one of the reasons that cities encourage, let's make this place nice, is because it drives up property values, drives up the rent, and raises the tax base. And so On the one hand, yes, it is nice. Like everyone, I think, feels this about these spaces. But on the other hand, there is still a violence of urban development in the background.
Sure, and I don't disagree with you. However, I would say that there is a racial violence to gentrification and there is a racial violence to the urban renewal movement that preceded it, right?
Yeah,
So, you know, we can certainly sit and think about how can it be the case that both enjoying the city and being afraid of the city are both ways for white people to exercise power over Black people, right? Like it's not a coincidence that these seem like opposite tendencies, and yet the end effect is the same, right? That the end effect is racism, whether it's urban renewal or the embrace of the city. But I think that we can hold those harms in mind while also thinking about, well, what else is happening here?
sure. So when I am at my most cynical, I would just say that this is what art is, right? That in the United States, art is a form of racial violence. And I mean, sometimes it works against that, but it has a violence at its core. And when we talk about these aesthetic questions, what does it look like? You know, it's a way of eliding the question of what does art actually do? And that's probably one of the motivations between calling this podcast bad art, right? Like even the art that we like is is violent, and we want to take that into account. So just Martha Schwartz's landscaping that replaced Tilted Arc. This type of art is what Miwan Kwan, an art historian who I rely a lot on for this episode, would call art as public space. So she has a typology, like art in public spaces might be what Richard Serra is doing, but art as public spaces is more of this type of art. And then she says there's also art in the public interest, which comes up at this time. So the other thing that the NEA and other organizations start sponsoring is art that is claiming to solve social problems or to address social problems, or to engage community in positive ways. An example of this in Philadelphia, where I am now, there's something called the Kensington Storefront, run by Mural Arts, which is the biggest arts institution in Philadelphia. And it's just in a neighborhood that's been hit really hard by the opioid epidemic. And the idea is having an arts space open in the neighborhood will help people struggling with drugs to move into recovery. I'm very skeptical of this program, but this is where art has been going, into like explicit provision of social services. Another classic example is this piece, Waiting for Godot, which was put on in New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina as a community produced play about the pain of waiting for services and rebuilding to arrive. So there's this direct engagement in solving social problems, which is another one of the ways that the NEA has decided to prove that art is useful. So one other thing that I wanted to read in just to get where the National Endowment of the Arts is changing its tune. So this is a NEA statement about what public art does in 2018. It's speaking specifically about that Waiting for Godot piece. But it says, when most people think about public art, they think of a mural or a wall on a building, or perhaps a large sculpture in a park. While murals and sculptures are certainly public art, they are far from the only ways that public art can be expressed. Perhaps a better term for public art would be community art. Art by, for, and of the community in which it's presented. Sometimes the art can be practical, integrated within stormwater management systems, for example, or a health-related public space. But it doesn't even have to be visual art. Citywide sings are public art, as are dance performances in community parks or orchestras playing local bars. Public art can also be a source of community healing. A poignant example was a 2005 performance of Waiting for Godot in two New Orleans neighborhoods. And you can just hear the emphasis on art is useful here as opposed to where it had been 20 years prior.
Yeah, and it certainly is such a sea change from the original mission of public art in the 1960s.
Yeah.
Yeah, just even the idea that public art is of, by, and for the community is in some ways a complete inversion of where this public art idea began, right?
Yeah.
The idea in the 1960s was very much we are bringing something to this community that the community otherwise would lack, right? So
Right.
there's for all, we really like trashed the 1960s public art mission, but not to say that you got to hand it to them. But one small good thing that I think could be rescued from that original public art mission of the 1960s is the redistributive impulse, right? So we talked about this derisive term, plop art, but the idea of putting the museum outdoors was that when the museum was indoors, people lacked access to it, and that was an equity issue. And therefore, we need to take this art that has been treated as a luxury good for the upper classes and give it to the masses. So to go from that to this idea that the only art that matters is art that is already part of that community, it's like, well, then why does the NEA need to be behind that, right?
Yeah. I mean, that's an interesting comment. I think another thing that I think about here as a takeaway, I think that takeaway is really strong. I think another takeaway for me is just thinking about the idea that art in the United States is politically instrumentalized. At least if you're not Richard Serra refusing to participate, it always is funded for a particular goal, whether that's urban renewal, whether that's to be useful to the community, whether that's to make a public space that people will want to congregate in. And I think that's important, partly because this has come up recently with Trump canceling public art and saying we're going to redirect public art funds to our political goals. And he said, his letter, which went out to all of these organizations, is the NEA is updating its grant-making priorities to focus on projects that reflect the nation's rich artistic heritage and creativity as prioritized by the president. The NEA will now prioritize celebrating the nation's HBCUs, the 250th anniversary of American independence, AI competency, houses of worship, assist with disaster recovery, foster skilled trade jobs, make America healthy again, support the military, and so on. So he lists these goals that he wants art to serve, which are problematic. But a lot of the response has been, that's not art. Art isn't political in this way, but it always has been, right? And so maybe it shouldn't be, but right now it is. And so it's worth fighting about what the politics of public art are. What should it achieve is, I think, a real question that needs to be asked and contested.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. In many different domains of American public life, the veneer of neutrality is not really serving anyone
Right.
anymore. So let's just throw that out.
Yeah. And let's build big walls through the middle of public spaces, making them less hospitable.
Hell yeah.
Um, all right. On that note, we should wrap up for today. So thank you for listening, everyone. This has been Bad Art, a podcast about the politics of art in the 21st century. I'm Colin McLaughlin-Alcock,
I'm Marielle Grushko.
and we've really enjoyed having this conversation with you. Please do let us know what you think. Is public art innocent or guilty? Speaking for myself, I don't know what an innocent public art would look like, but that doesn't mean I don't still want public art around. Please tell your friends, like the podcast, subscribe, listen again. We look forward to talking to you more in the future. Thanks.
Thanks. Bye.